Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks, everyone. Um, Welcome to the webinar, Navigating Change in Public Administration in partnership with the National Academy of Public Administration. Thank you for sponsoring. I'm Michael Crosby, CEO of Leadership Connect. We're a public sector data business. We host these webinars to help share best practices and ideas for leaders and staff in government. Our topic today is navigating change in public administration, inspired by the book, for those of you who remember, Who Moved My Cheese? Some of us probably remember that book. It's an easy read. We'll cover topics today of leadership, navigating change, communicating with your teams and stakeholders, and technology. I'll go through some brief logistics before doing a brief intro of our speakers, and we'll jump into our topics. So please feel free to use the chat to submit questions as we go through our session. We'll do our best to integrate them into the back and forth with the panelists. If not, we'll leave them to the end. To help get CPE credits, we'll have 3 poll questions during the webinar. So please submit your answers to those, and we'll provide that feedback near real time. And there'll be some good takeaways to take back to your team after the webinar. And then finally, we'll send a brief summary of the results of our webinar to everyone who's registered, and we'll look to get that out over the next 48 hours. So now let me introduce our fantastic speakers, and maybe speakers, if you can turn your cameras on now. We'll start with Secretary Brian Slater, who's Secretary with the Commonwealth of Virginia. He's a longtime public servant, holding positions at the federal level, at the Department of Labor, DOT, SBA in the White House, Richmond grad, which is where he is right now in Richmond. Go Spiders. James Christian Lockwood, he's President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. Prior to that, he most recently held executive positions at the Partnership for Public Service, GAO, also with DOD, DHS, and the DEA, along with teaching at Syracuse, the Orangeman, and Maria Thompson, Executive Government Advisor in Cybersecurity at AWS. She's a longtime cybersecurity expert, working as an executive advisor. Before that, held chief risk officer positions with the state of Carolina and spent her early career in the Marine Corps. Local UMD TERP. I'm based in DC, so it's great. And then last but not least, Julia Novak. She's CEO, Executive Director of International City County Management Association, ICMA. Prior to that, spent some time in industry, but held a long stretch of work in city management leadership roles in towns such as Rye and Rockville, George Mason Patriot. So let's get to the topic questions. This came up with each of our panelists getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. So in our prep call, James Christian and I spoke about the mindset of managing through discomfort, something I think most of us are experiencing, well, with any change in administration. It's a recurring theme. Who is comfortable these days? And this question is for each panelist. And we'll start with you, Julia, because you're on my far left on the Zoom call. What are your techniques and best practices for getting your team comfortable with the uncomfortable?
Yeah. Well, I think about that, and I think about, what do you need in order to move through it together? And so to me, there's 3 steps. The first is to just acknowledge the discomfort, acknowledge the unknown. It is when things are moving and we don't know where they're going or what to anticipate next, it makes all of us uncomfortable, and frankly, even the leader. And so I think acknowledging that is a really important first step. The second piece is to communicate, because communicating when it comes to change and when it comes to uncertainty, it's important to be authentic with the people that you're leading and helping them understand where you are, what your mindset is, and then most importantly, focus them on what's next. That's the enrollment step. So enroll them in where you're going. What is the change? What are we moving towards? Why is this? What is the good possibilities of outcome here? So think about ACE: acknowledge, communicate, and enroll.
Like that concept, enrolling. James Christian, what's your view?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And, the first thing I'd point out is that leaders don't have all the answers. And quite frankly, there are going to be a number of leaders that are going to be dealing with the same level of discomfort, whether they show it or not. That just happens to be the case. The three things that I would point out is one is understanding the external environment. It's very similar to acknowledging it, but you have to really understand what's going on. I'll use a current situation to emphasize that point. Right now, when you think about government and public administration, many have the view that public administration might be under assault or attack. Others might think that this is just democracy at work with a current administration carrying out an agenda as promised when campaign. So there's a lot to understand and unpack here. But the first thing is you have to understand, if you're uncomfortable, what is the environment like and why? The second would be understanding yourself. I think this is really important. From a perspective of government, you might have someone who would think, well, I want to carry out my oath, and that's what my values are, and that's what my principles might be. And then you might, on the other hand, have someone that says, the job isn't necessarily about my personal opinion or view. Rather, it's to carry out that of someone else. But you have to know where you sit in this. So if you're uncomfortable with a situation, you're uncomfortable with where you are, what does it mean specifically for you? And you have to be introspective about that. The third thing I would say is understand the job. What are your responsibilities? What are the expectations placed on you? And also, what are the limitations? And I think this is really important. Think about, how do you motivate your team? And how do you make sure they have the right morale? How do they have the right direction, the right vision? How do they understand the environment that they're in? You have to be able to explain what the job is. You have to be able to tell them that as a public servant, these are your responsibilities, these are your expectations, and that here are also the limitations. Here are things that you're not expected to do. So I guess, I would say that this is all very, very hard for anyone. No leader has the right answer, but they have to kind of lead their team through it. And as long as they're helping them to understand the external environment, they're helping them to understand where they are as a leader and how they need to show up, and then how their job and their responsibilities relate to that, I think is the best advice I could offer.
Awesome. Thanks, James Christian. We got our poll results. So morale was the top answer on concerns. So maybe we can work this in, if not this question, on later ones. What are your thoughts, Maria?
So all great answers that have been given so far. So it's kind of hard to follow up from those last two. But I want to double click on something that Julia mentioned. She mentioned communication, and I do want to emphasize how important that is. Because when you think about not just public administration and anything that we do, I think about my time in the military. We have this term called the fog of war. And that's the confusion, that's the misunderstandings, that's chaos that can happen when you're in a military environment. And usually the reason because of that is because there's no communication. There's not good communication. No one knows about the adversary, no one knows, et cetera. So that creates a lot of confusion. And when you think about public administration, you think about government, we as leaders need to make sure that we are communicating often and clearly to our employees, our staff members, our team members, so that they understand that we're all in this boat, going in the right direction, and hopefully the right direction, right? A couple of other things that I would always say is like lead by example. So as leaders in the roles that we play, we have to ensure that we are providing that, I guess, that template for our teams to model, and that we're following what we should be, what we're putting out there. Another thing I would say is collaboration. I'm very big on collaboration and information sharing, which is also part of communicating, right? Making sure that you foster an environment that allows for collaboration across the team, cross communication, cross collaboration, so that we're all learning from each other. And that kind of helps to also build our knowledge bank within our organization, so we know exactly, there's no gaps. When we find those gaps, we're able to fill those gaps with people and resources within our environment. So those are some of the things that I would say kind of helps with the disruption that can occur in an organization and how to mitigate those.
That's great, Maria. And I think communication, transparency, collaboration. I know in our prep calls, those are three key words that came through in a lot of our topic questions today. So I just want to remind everyone of that. Brian's always tough being the fourth in answering the question, but would you like to add to the topic?
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for being here. And I can't agree more with what everyone has said. I think it's really important to talk about it, to explain the rationale behind the action if you know it, to get the team to give their thoughts, to be transparent, do full disclosure, and talk about, usually our job is to implement and address that, hear their concerns, and ask them how they would implement. And if they're opposed, ask them how they would implement it, even though they're opposed to it. I think it's really important to deal with the uncomfortable head on. Nobody expects to get everything that they want, but people do expect to at least be heard and to have an opportunity to give express their concerns and their reservations and their opinions, and to give them that opportunity.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. So we'll move to our next topic, and that's doing more with less. Everyone, I think, experienced this topic, but maybe slightly different language. I know, Maria, in our prep call, you felt like that's one of the mantras of the Marine Corps is doing more with less. And James Christian, you mentioned state and local leaders and government always being scrappy. Not like those bad guys who always have money to burn. And then for myself, working in private equity for a long time, refer to it as spreadsheet math, when you just change the numbers on a page and magically it looks great, but someone's actually got to implement the more with less. So we'll go in reverse order. What are your management philosophies when thinking about doing more with less? We'll start with you, Brian.
I think it's really important to prioritize, what is most important, and to focus on the resources that you do have, to do that which is most important first. Look at ways to create efficiencies. I think it requires a deep dive to look at, okay, where's the fat versus where's the bone, and how do you prioritize it? Looking at things, everything from zero-based budgeting to shared service options. How do you consolidate? How do you standardize? How do you optimize? How do you centralize? And how do you use, IT or AI to reduce costs and to do more with less? Look at your options instead of just doing things the way that they've always been done. Explore new options and new opportunities.
That's great, Brian. And you mentioned using IT for efficiency. Maria, we talked a little bit about that. What are your thoughts on this topic?
And this topic is very near and dear to me because being in cybersecurity, I think we've always had to be a little bit scrappy, because we have the business driving a lot of the missions that we're tasked with supporting. And then, of course, as cybersecurity professionals, we're required to protect, secure the data, protect the privacy of the data, and all these things, make sure those security controls are in place and are operating efficiently. So I taking a cybersecurity lens, and when I speak to customers, this is what I see a lot, is that they're learning now that to be more scrappy, and it's really going back to what Secretary Slater mentioned as far as prioritization, looking at where are the critical workloads within your environment, wrapping the security controls, focusing on those areas as a priority versus maybe trying to boil the ocean. Taking a look at what are those resources across your organization that you can leverage to help you secure that environment as well. And resources could be other tools, capabilities. It could be other personnel and other teams that can be part of your overall team to help you accomplish that mission. And I would also say, again, look at those strategic partnerships that you can create that can help you to do more, with what you have, because we're seeing it from a cybersecurity perspective that funding is getting cut in various areas. So we do have to be scrappy. We do have to leverage AI for automation, for integration, those types of things that will help to do things more efficiently so that our teams can focus on those core areas that they need to prioritize and focus on.
Excellent. And I think that aligns with the poll results we just got, which focused on technology, vendor optimization. We're tied for second. Team resource allocation was the number one answer we just got from our poll. James Christian, you love the scrappy concept. Would you like to add to the discussion?
Yeah, and Michael, when we spoke, I don't know that I said that federal government has money to burn. I might have said that they're more resourced than our state and local counterparts for sure. Doing more with less is a concept that most in government is very familiar with. It's something that most public servants, at least those I've worked with, have always strived to do. It's not a matter of having endless resources. It's about taking those resources and using them in the best ways to serve the public. The three things that I would mention is in order to help kind of figure out how do you do more with less is one, focus on impact. If you understand with whatever resources you have, what's the impact that you're going for and what's the impact that your service or your benefit has, that's a good place to start. The second thing is to look at what can you really do without. I mean, these are the type of questions that are being asked right now, whether the process to asking them is one that we think is the best or not. That's the main question is what can we do without? And I think when you start to think about that, it gets you closer to how do you do more with less. And then as we look at this third concept that I'd want to raise is as we look at artificial intelligence and how humans interact with AI, there really isn't just a singular AI or technological solution that's going to allow you to do better, do more. There's always, in my view, going to be some degree of a human element. And what the trick is, you need to find the right balance. How do you use technology? How do you use AI? And how does it complement what we do as human beings to the work that we're trying to do? And so if you kind of take those three things into effect, you could probably do more with less, looking at what can you do without, what's the ultimate impact you want to have or you do have, and then what's the right balance of incorporating technology and leading breaking innovations to help you do your work.
Excellent. James Christian, you did not say that as being provocative because people getting some food coma after lunch and money to burn will lead into our third topic. But Julia, you're at the heart of state and local doing more with less. Like what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, everyone has to do more with less, and nobody likes less. Isn't that what they say? That's not their favorite person to do things with. So we have to acknowledge that, and I think this is where process really does come into to be an opportunity. Oftentimes, when organizations have a period of stability, processes grow up around the organization that end up being barriers. And when there's an opportunity to take a fresh look because we can't maybe do things the way we've been doing them, is that a time to look at our policies, to look at internal processes? My colleagues have mentioned AI as a tool for innovation, AI also as a tool for process innovation can be a useful application. So I think that would be the one thing that I might add to the statements that have already been made.
Excellent. Thanks, Julia. So, speaking of the trend against money, to burn, we've seen a number of mini, doges, pop up at the state and local level around the country. And in our prep, we talked about assessing mission creep, regulatory bloat. Those are priority. What priorities are important. But a couple of our panelists had mentioned, there's nothing new here. The name might be brand new, but the concept is a recurring theme in government if you go back decades. So maybe we'll start. You had a lot of great conversation on this, Brian. Maybe we'll start with you on this whole mini Doge concept to kick things off.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I think change happens in government every 15 to 20 years. You go back, for those of us who are old enough to remember the Reagan cuts that took place back in the 80s. You look at some of the things that went on during the Clinton administration, where there was the BRAC and base realignment reform and an overall 450,000 employee reductions in the federal government. You look at welfare reform, parole reform. I know in Virginia, when I was in Governor Gilmore's cabinet 25 years ago, we created a new Secretary of Technology. Well, about 15 years later, they abolished it and rolled it back into where it was. I think that's the nature of government. The one constant is change. I think you look at things, like I said, about shared services. How do you centralize and standardize? When you're talking about the reg process and regulations in general, I've always taken the approach, and we've taken the approach here, is why are you doing what you're doing? Why do you do it? What is it there for? Who does it protect? I've had a lot of successes getting people to give their input. Tell us, what are you doing that they don't think we should be doing? What are we not doing that they think they should be doing? And if they were in charge, what would they change? What makes sense? A lot of rank and file staff are the people who actually know how programs work, and they can tell you. They'll go through the process of doing the process as it is. But if you ask them to give you their thoughts, they will. This is how I would change this, quote, if I were in charge. And I think that's really important. And I think it's important to be honest and to empower them to give their feedback. And I think that's how you deal with that. But change is constant, and it's going to continue to happen. And in 15 to 20 years, something else will pop up.
James, Christian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I might not be old enough to have experienced the Reagan era directly, but I'm smart enough to have studied it. And I think that's right. This is not necessarily a new concept. The Department of Government Efficiency and the work that is happening there is something that's been tried before with other administrations. One of the things that's different, though, is this is with the backing of a president that really means it and is not afraid of the consequences that come with really disruptive change. And I think that, and the pace and the speed to which that's trying to be implemented really makes a big difference. There's arguments on the how piece and the rhetoric around it, which we could always do better there. But the other big difference is in the past, you had many leaders that would have thought change has to be accomplished in a box. It happens this way. We've studied it. We know it. This is how it's done best. And the current president looks at that box, in my view, and kind of broke it wide open and said, we can look not just outside the box. We're not even confine ourselves to a box at all in how we approach this change. And not only just opened the box, but kind of vowed not to put it back together either. And so when you think about these efforts right now, the Department of Government Efficiency, and you're thinking about change, it's not necessarily new, but what it's doing, though, is having most people think in ways that they have not been tested and have not been thinking for quite some time. How do you go about that change in a completely different way, really reimagining it, but then also saying, we're not going to limit ourselves to what those consequences might be. Whereas there are previous leaders, previous organizations that do that full analysis and say, well, if these are all the consequences, here's how we would approach it differently, or here are the things that we wouldn't do, which in my estimation is also a smart approach to think about as well.
Excellent. Thanks, James, Christian. And we had a participant question, and it actually leads into our next topic, which is communication and hand holding your team. I mean, so far on this call and then in our prep, everyone stressed the importance of communications and different techniques around that and navigating the team through change. The question from the participant are, what are the parallels with the early days of COVID? And, Julia, that was the exact discussion, we had in our prep. So maybe I'll kick it off with you around, communication strategies, really thinking of your team and your own organization.
Yeah, I think the communication piece is truly key. And I think consistent communication from leadership. And it can be at the top. It also needs to happen from within. Our organizations have to have responsibility for communicating and creating dialogue with their employees. But the leader also has to set a tone and be steady and consistent in providing that communication. And the other thing that I think can be really helpful is, not just the one-way communication, but how can we bring people together? And so today we come together with Zoom meetings or Teams meetings, and there's lots of ways to connect. take advantage of that opportunity that I think COVID really put in place for us to connect with people, answer their questions authentically to the degree that you can. And this is a place where I would say, when front and center with your team, leading with empathy is very important to help people through the change and help get them to the other side of where we need to go together. Because ultimately, it's service delivery that we care about. It happens to be Public Service Recognition Week, and so kind of talking about this and the people who deliver the service, that's the obligation of the leader, is to take care of them so they can provide the service to the people.
And can you give an example of like leading with empathy? I mean, I think that's a great concept.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's the acknowledgement of where people are, acknowledging the discomfort, owning your own level of discomfort. That's a little bit about empathy, putting yourself in their shoes and saying that I know this is hard. I understand this, seems chaotic. It's unpredictable. Saying the words that people are thinking but are afraid to say sometimes just kind of lowers the temperature in the room and allows people to feel like, okay, it's not just me that's having some anxiety or angst about this. But it's a common thing. And so we have each other through this. And so demonstrating that from the very beginning is where I think leadership can show up smartly.
Excellent. Thanks, Julia. James, Christian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Julia got it exactly right. Some of those tools, some of the greatest tool that you might have is around communication, and it needs to be two-way. It needs to be often so that people hear that message. Needs to be transparent. I think from a leadership perspective, something to keep in mind is actions speak just as much as words, and so it's not just the things you say, but it's what you do. And then, for a leader, it's also to keep in mind that while you're going to have a lot of people who are watching you, a lot of people listening to the words that you may have, when you give a message to someone on a hard situation, example might be having to let go or separate people from your organization that have been there a long time, are high performers, want to be there, but for circumstances outside of your control, you need to make that decision. It really isn't about you as the leader, or really even the organization. If you make it more about the people that are on your team and the people that you're leading, and you also make it more about the people that you're serving and those that your organization or your folks are there to help, that can really emphasize the importance of whatever message you're trying to get across. So I mean, communication, doing it as early as possible, as often, as transparently, making sure that you have mechanisms that you're both putting messages out, but also receiving it, keeping everyone in mind. People first is always a good way to help with uncomfortable times, hard messages that may otherwise you wouldn't want to deliver.
Thanks, James, Christian. And so we just spent some time focus internally around communication. Now I want to turn to partnerships as a way of focusing externally. And I think of Leadership Connect. We often work with clients and talk about building a relationship before you need it, which is often a theme of partnerships. Maria, you shared some great stories when you're with the state of North Carolina aimed at cybersecurity. We talked about the theme of cost savings using AI and technology, and thinking about looking at building coalitions and partnerships, both whether it's with government, state, local, or with industry. Can you share some insights and best practices of what works? And we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that I'm very proud of that we were able to implement in North Carolina, and it's been formalized since I've left there, is like the Joint Cyber Task Force. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because this started off as a grassroots movement between myself, my office at the state IT, local government IT. We had our federal partners that were in the room. We had our National Guard cyber partners in the room. And we all came together and said, we need to be able to have a team on standby whenever there are any disruptions statewide across the state and in different organizations, agencies, local governments, so on and so forth. And what that helped us to do was it really fast-tracked our ability to build relationships across all those various entities and allow them to know that we are here as a resource for them if there are any cyber events that happen. And I'll tell you, during the pandemic and prior to the pandemic, we really saw a need for that. So we were able to build that prior to, and then when the pandemic hit and we had a lot of ransomware attacks that were happening, we had those resources already, and we had our tactics, techniques, and procedures down on how we were going to engage with every entity that was impacted by any type of cyber event. So I think, having that knowledge of what are those resources that are out there that you can tap into to help to build your team and strengthen your team and strengthen your mission is definitely something that organizations should consider. And then on the other end, I'd say the other story that I would share is around if the audience is not aware of what's called the whole of state cybersecurity motion. This has been ongoing for now, I would say, roughly probably about 5 years now. I think it's been something that some states have been actively pursuing. And that is the acknowledgement, again, that we have limited resources, change is happening, we have threats that are changing across our organization. So how can we efficiently and effectively use the funds, sometimes small funds, the resources that we have more efficiently to mitigate those risks statewide? So it's, looking at, do we procure a solution, a technology at the enterprise level that can then, support local government entities, K-12, in mitigating the risks across their organization? Is it a procurement vehicle that allows for faster procurement? Is it, boots on the ground resources that they're going to need? All of these things are all part of that, figuring out how to do more with less. And it really is all about building those relationships. And I can tell you that if we were not able to have those relationships in place, a lot of organizations would really have been, critically impacted by cyber events. So it really, I can't say enough about information sharing, intel sharing, cross collaboration. All of those things are really core to, to having a strong foundation, especially as it pertains to cybersecurity.
That's excellent, Maria. And we just got a question from a participant, so maybe I'll add Julia and Ryan into the mix. So the question is, how would you recommend states, plan to tackle, new missions that had traditionally been federal? So thinking about, potentially picking up, some FEMA work, disaster, resilience. So when I think of doing more with less in partnerships, you start to tackle on, any work that migrates from, the feds back down to the state and local. So, Julia, I'll go to you and then Brian.
Yeah. I mean, tactically, I think this is one of the really important strategies for state and local governments to be thinking about, because there's some shifting happening at the federal level that trickles down and has huge impacts on state and local governments. And their readiness and ability to care for people in their communities after the immediate response of disaster relief happens. And so this is where I think we have to lean on policy. There's a framework that we have this agreement to how we're going to, how different levels of government are going to tax, what services they're going to provide, and we kind of get comfortable with that. So now that there might be change, what are the other policy changes that are going to go along with this to allow a different type of service delivery model or a different level of service delivery by lower state and local governments in this time? So I think it's a time for advocacy and looking for clarification and understanding. I think a policy advocacy approach is important because sometimes if we're willing to acknowledge the unintended consequences of a decision, we can work together to find a solution that works for everybody. And I think that's where we're going to be as some of these programs are eliminated. What does that mean? How can we work together to partner to take care of the people in this country? Because that is ultimately part of government's job.
And Brian, your thoughts? So, thinking of partnerships, doing more with less, which is kind of the theme of partnerships, and then potentially taking on more from the feds if it gets pushed down to the state level.
I think it depends on a couple of things. If federal programs or federal projects or federal activities are going to be pushed down to the state level, I think obviously it depends on whether any money comes with it or not. If money comes with it, hopefully the strings that go along with most of the federal government funds that you get a lot of times don't come with it, which allows you some greater flexibility to implement things at the state level than at the federal level. I know one of the things that they're talking about is taking some of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act funds and pushing them down in more of a state grant type of opportunity. And that may actually benefit us because it would give us greater flexibility to focus on where the needs really are, as opposed to being buttonholed or pigeonholed into these dollars can only be used for this activity. If the duties or responsibilities are pushed down and no federal money comes with it, that's another problem. And that's where states are going to need to, once again, go back and look at prioritizing, what's the most important thing that needs to be done and how do we fund it?
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. So we were talking about your teams, then looking externally through partnerships. Now maybe, focused on, oneself, James Christian, you were talking about organization and leadership transition in 2025. And, clearly everyone's going through that, right now, wherever you are in the public sector. When you think of, a person's leadership traits, how you share, what works, what doesn't work. What should participants on this call consider, today? We'll start with you first, James Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I think leadership is probably the single most important thing to getting anything consequential done. The first thing that I would say is have a learning mindset. Be open to learning from history and things that have happened before you. Be open to learning from other people. Now, you still need to carve your own path, but you certainly want to be open to that. And so I think learning is really important. The second, I would say, is being authentic. Authenticity is really important to leadership. People will know if they can't trust what you say you're gonna do, if you're gonna actually do it. People will know if you yourself don't believe what you're actually saying. And people will know if it's scripted and it's not something that you're able to just kind of speak from the heart, if you will. And so I think those things are important, and being authentic is really important. Courage is also something that I would say is important to leadership. Being willing to say things that other people won't say. It's hard to do, but that's certainly a leadership characteristic that's important. And then, very similarly, being able to do things that others maybe don't join you in, and you have to go at it alone. Those are things that are important. So three kind of traits that I think would really help is having a learning mindset, being authentic, and having courage. Things that I would say that you shouldn't do, and maybe I've learned from watching others, and maybe a lesson or two from myself, is don't try to be someone else, and don't try to be a leader that you've maybe just seen, but you haven't really yourself aspired to be. I think you're your own unique type of leader, and you want to carve your own path. So don't do that. The other thing is, don't do actions or take or say things that you wouldn't want to appear or you wouldn't want said when it's the end of life. So if you're going to have something written on a tombstone, or you're going to have an obituary, or you're going to have someone talk about what your contributions have been in life, you don't want to do anything that they would say something that would make you think twice about what you did. And then the probably most important thing that I might add, and just kind of to part for folks here, is really know yourself, know your own values, carve your own path, and no matter what you do, just be proud of any words that you say or any actions that you take. I mean, that to me is one of the single most things that's important to leadership. If you can wake up, say something, do something, change lives, make really hard decisions, do your best given the information you have at the time. And at the end of the day, you can say, I am proud of what I've done. That to me will set you up for success as a leader, and hopefully others will see that and want to follow.
That's great. That's powerful, James Christian, especially thinking about what's going to be on your tombstone. Hopefully, we're all decades away from that. Julia, what are your thoughts on this topic?
he said it all so amazingly well. It was very inspiring. And I think this is where, when we remember who's in the audience, you know, that there is what were the characters in Who Moved My Cheese? Hem and Haw and Sniff and Scurry. They're all out there, right? There are people that are going to be eager to go with us on the journey, and there's others that we're going to have to carry along. Remembering that, bringing them with us, and doing everything he just said, I think that really is how you put that leadership framework into motion.
And Michael,
Excellent.
if I could add
Sure.
to that real
Yeah.
quickly, I think the one thing that and this was a learning experience for myself, is as I transitioned in different roles. If you think about the tenure of a state CIO, I think it's at 24 months. So when we talk about leadership, that, you know, the organization has to survive once that leader moves on, transitions. And so it really is making sure that you've created a culture within your organization that innovation still occurs, that the projects are still moving forward, and that it doesn't, you know, it's not a standstill. And I will say, unfortunately, I've seen that happen in, you know, various organizations where they run into this issue because of the constant churn of the leaders, and maybe not necessarily having those foundations in place, that, you know, there's not as much modernization efforts that are ongoing, optimization that's happening because of that piece, that layer that's not been put in place. So I would encourage, you know, as part of your, you know, your leadership growth, is to ensure that you're building that into your whole plan, so that the organization, again, can thrive once you've moved on.
It's a great point on the turnover. It's, you know, we track over 1 million people in the public sector, and, you know, not having come from the, you know, public sector until I joined this organization, benchmarking, you know, people in leadership positions and policy positions. I think the average is, I think it's 21 months for most positions. So often people they're almost like they're renting the position as opposed to really staying there. So it puts a lot of stress on an individual and organization to really be successful and build processes that will make their group better, so the next person can come along and build on that. And then when there's changes in administration, that makes it even more difficult. So there might be a misalignment on policy. So, you know, I think everyone's got their work cut out, you know, with leadership. And there's not that perception in the private sector that there's that now a change, apart from, I mean, this year. There's clearly a lot of PR around the level of change in government at all levels right now. Speaking of change, so, you know, next topic, let's turn to technology and cost saving. So, you know, recurring theme over the last, you know, 10 years. Pulled some stats. So federal, state, and local is up to 38% of the nation's economy, up from, you know, 31% 20 years ago. So it's, you know, about 30%. You know, clearly this year is a focus on cost restraint and using technology. We talked about Doge. When you think of, you know, let's start with tech and AI, like, how are you approaching your teams and, you know, your larger community around you when you're looking for savings, you're looking for innovation, and maybe you're our cybersecurity specialist, Maria. Let's start with you on this one.
Awesome, thank you. So one of the things that I like to focus on when I speak to customers is, one, if you're using cloud, let's talk about cloud optimization, because sometimes, you know, over time, organizations might leverage the cloud for a specific workload, and it's a one and done. And there's no constant optimization that's happening, continuous monitoring to make sure that they're efficiently using the solutions that are there and the technology to continue the mission, but also reduce cost. So I would encourage, you know, customers, as I speak with them, is take a look at your environment. It's never we talked about change being constant. It's the same thing. You have to make sure that there's continuous monitoring, continuous optimization of those tools and of those services that you're putting in place. So, you know, speak with your vendor partners, whatever it is, to make sure that you're looking for ways to reduce cost there. As it pertains to cybersecurity, obviously AI is big in what we're doing now with cybersecurity, because most security tools have been using some level of machine learning or AI for decades. So, but now we have Gen AI and all these other ways of efficiently identifying those risks quickly so that we can mitigate those risks across our organization. So think about how you can leverage automation as part of your efforts, having those tools that are integrated with each other. And in some cases, take a look at your stack and say, I might have too much of a sprawl. There's something that I can remove from my environment, and I need to, fine tune the services that I'm providing, because in cases, sometimes more tools result in more problems. So really looking at your overall organization and identifying what is needed, what are those critical things, and then try to put those puzzle pieces together, make sure that you have an end-to-end vision of cyber and threats across your environment. Make sure that your teams are trained, because then if the tools need to be tuned, your teams and your employees need to be tuned as well on a regular basis. And I would also say, never forget about innovation, because I think sometimes whenever there's cost cutting, the first thing that goes is innovation. It's keeping the lights on. But we are in the public sector, and we have to provide services to our customers, our citizens. And so we have to make sure that we're giving them the most secure services that are out there, the best services, the more simplified service that meets our mission needs, but also brings, a value to them as well. And that takes innovation. So we have to continue to foster that mindset or culture of innovation within our organization. So we're seeing, as things change, there are opportunities that might come up that we can really tap into and make sure that we're, again, having that continuous flow of information, modernization, and all those things. Because if we're not modernizing our environment, we are open ourselves to a lot of risks, which we don't want. And we have a lot of data. Public sector, we're sitting on a lot of data right now. And if we're not doing something with that data, if we're not protecting it, if we're not making sure that we're efficiently using it so that it can give us decision-making skills and enable our decision-making skills, then I think we're doing our citizens a disservice as well. And that means we have to leverage technology to the best that we can, but we can still do that in a safe, effective, and efficient way.
Awesome answer, Maria. And as a longtime data and technology executive, like I look at freeing up resources using technology. I mean, this is one of the, it's not the oldest trick in the book, but it's up there. And you just look at the parallels between AI and cloud services are, to me, pretty similar. Where 20 years ago there was a huge investment, $100+ billion in internet and cloud services, and a lot of those businesses ended off going bust. But ultimately, it allowed for really affordable cloud services for public sector organizations, company like mine, where if I look at what we're doing today versus 10 years ago, our hosting bill would be 10 times what it is today. And you think of AI, there's been $250 billion invested in the AI space over the last 5 years. Now, there's only 10 billion of revenue to show for it, but it tells you like all this money is being spent. That innovation can be leveraged at both the public sector and private sector level, kind of on the cheap, and experiment with it. That's another cool thing I think with AI is more the what I think is the citizen technologist. You don't need to be have a computer science degree and 20 years of coding experience to come up with ideas using AI. You can have a arts degree from wherever and be really effective with it.
And we're seeing, Michael, we're seeing AI, and I just want to add real quickly to that. We're seeing AI in various use cases that you never think of. So there's multiple case studies out there of reducing, hours and man hours of time that down to minutes. And so when you think about how you can apply those types of services to, use cases within your organization, I mean, I would say sky's the limit. Now, I would say AI is not the hammer for everything, right? AI can't be applied to everything. And we would never think of doing that. You do have to be very specific about the use cases that you use it for, but there's a lot of value out there. And we just need to embrace that technology and understand where it makes, where it's a good fit for our organization and drives the mission of that organization.
Right. Great point. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what Maria was just talking about was spot on. I mean, I think AI can be used to move people from lower value to higher value work. If you've got, budgetary constraints and financial constraints, then take and upskill people to higher value work and use AI where applicable, to take care of lower value operations. And I look back at what we did at the Department of Labor, which was implementation of shared services, for IT. And it would have been very easy if the secretary had given a mandate and said, everyone shall do this, but he didn't. He told me I had to go convince people that it was the right thing to do. And that's what we embarked on. And that's what made it successful, is getting buy-in from people. But we really started looking at how to consolidate, centralize, and standardize to become, more efficient. I mean, I'm not the IT person, but I look at how do you operationalize, IT on a day-to-day basis, and looking at everything from, your licenses to your laptops and getting people what they need, not necessarily what they want. We shifted to a situation from every agency at the department buying its own laptops and getting them outfitted with whatever images and software they wanted on it, to a standardized package. You could pick one of 3 laptops based on what your need is, and they weren't purchased anymore. They were all leased. We did a complete review of all of our licenses. Does someone really need a high-end graphics license if you've only got 3 people in the department who actually do that? Looking at those types of things, looking at enterprise licenses, for other activities. One of the things that we looked at too is we had 15 agencies. Each agency had its own CIO. My approach was, we don't need 15 CIOs. We need one CIO. And you can have departmental IT heads, but you need one person looking at IT from a strategic standpoint, looking down. Like I said, that's not a strategic operation. It's more of a tactical and an operationalization of IT to actually look at how do you save money.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. So turning to the next topic. So a lot of what we discussed today really assumes every decision is in place and is unmovable from a policy point of view. But a couple of you touched on, the term advocacy, and we know, with the big beautiful bill working its way through, the federal level, final spending and budgets, usually are quite different from what originally comes out in a proposal or an executive order or what have you. You use the example in our prep that 1 in 6 tariff requests from the prior Trump administration were approved. And so we've seen some decisions rescinded already at the federal, state, level. So when you're managing through this change, on one hand, you're saying to your team, okay, this is the situation, let's work with it. But on the other hand, your organization or your constituent organizations around you have the ability to change that outcome through advocacy. How do you navigate that? And Julia, I felt like you're kind of in the middle of all this within the ICMA. Maybe we'll start with you on that.
Yeah. No, I do think this is where the trickle down effect kind of comes home with our members in local government jurisdictions, because how is this end up going to play out in our local communities? And the fact is, we don't know. I made the comment about unintended consequences. What makes a decision final? If we understand the situation differently now because of something we didn't anticipate, are we willing to change things? And I think we're seeing that is a possibility. So for all of it, we can't say it's not actually going to happen. We can't live in that, kind of the world where denial is in front. And we also can't get caught up in the chaos, but we kind of have to link elbows and live into it together. Advocate where you can, adjust in your local communities. And I think this is where kind of local governments to a certain degree are the most resource constrained just because of tax policy and how things, play down. If this becomes the tension we have to live in, the need to innovate, the need to spend on technology and resource constraints, kind of when can you make those investments together to achieve outcomes for your communities? But it really does require you to focus on your mission, advocate where you can, adjust, and the phrase I use here is we have to live into this new reality together.
That's great, Julia. Brian, FEMA is moving from, as one of our audience members asked, FEMA is moving from the feds back to the states. You're excited, but there's no blank check coming with it. How do you balance advocacy on something like that?
Yeah, I think we all have our personal opinions and policy positions. And, when asked, we should share them and advocate for them. If not asked, we should, offer them up, but also, with the understanding that those that have decision rights over policies actually get to make that decision. And generally that decision should be followed. But I think also it is looking back historically, and I'll say this, I can remember when David Stockman in 1981 recommended abolishing the Department of Education and the Environmental Protection Agency. The last I looked, they were still down the street. Well, when I was in DC, they were still in downtown DC. The last Trump administration recommended combining the Department of Labor with the Department of Education. That didn't happen. I think you need to take a look at letting government run its course. It has a tendency to right size itself. It may not right size itself on everything, but in major things, it tends to right size itself and get to an equilibrium to where it rights the ship. I think it is important to advocate, and I think it's important to communicate. One of the things that I was going to say to an earlier question was, in a lack of information, the human mind goes to the worst possible scenario. So I think it's important to communicate and to over communicate. And I think it's important to get input, on policy and on legislation. But ultimately, in the end, a lot of our jobs, my job when I was in DC and my job now, is to implement and to take the tools that you're given and what you're given and try to make it the best operation you can. If we pick up state FEMA, hopefully some money will come with it, and we can implement a state plan that isn't quite as convoluted as the federal plan is. But I think letting government run its course and giving your input in the process is what's key.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. We have about 2.5 minutes left, so we'll move to our last topic. So I'll have each of you answer and maybe give a little closing remarks in 40 seconds. So we talked about change as a policy. You don't get to decide. A lot of what we talked about is talked about leadership, communication, but ultimately these are for now organizations based on people, not AI and robots. And getting people to change and work effectively requires organizational leadership expertise. So closing remarks, kind of share your thoughts on that, your secret sauce, and let's start with you, Julia.
Well, one of the things I think for our membership, professional local government managers, we understand that the policymakers, the elected officials, get to decide the values, and they make the policy decisions, and then our job is to implement with the pillars of public administration in mind, efficiency, equity, economy, and effectiveness. And so that is our job, to bridge these things in our local communities. And so I think kind of just being grounded in our mission, recognizing change is a policy. To do something, to not to do something is a decision that as the professional, you don't get to make, you get to implement. And so doing that in a way that aligns with kind of the call of public administration is what we have to keep in mind.
Excellent. Maria?
I think the only thing that I would add real quickly is, and I don't think we touched on it yet, is to, obviously there's a people aspect to everything, right? Our teams are they're foundational to everything that we do for public administration. We need to recognize them, recognize the successes that are happening within our organization as much as we can, because I think that will also help to build that culture where there's more collaboration and you have more people in that boat rowing in the right direction. So definitely provide that healthy feedback, but recognize the successes within your organization.
Great. Brian?
Is that me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to go back just real quick. You're talking about policy, changes. Policies can change, but I think the real key is the devil in the details and to how things are implemented. And I think getting involvement from, professionals into, okay, if this is our policy, how do we implement this policy the absolute best way possible so that it continues to serve the community and continues to serve the public? I mean, it's not always what you're doing, it's how you're doing it and what the end product ends up being.
Excellent. James Christian, final thought?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back real quick and just say on advocacy, I'm a firm believer that public servants aren't necessarily advocates. They can certainly advocate for people and services, but shouldn't necessarily be advocating for policy. Really, you want to think about data, evidence, experience, and making sure decision makers are making the best decisions. But as far as final thoughts here, the whole program, the whole question about who moved my government, it's kind of a rhetorical question. I think we know the answer to that. But the most important thing is that it'll be the people that ultimately decide what government looks like and how it's going to serve the public. And I would think more about three things I want to leave everyone with is one, see the opportunity ahead. That can be tough to do given the circumstances and maybe what's changing and then how their levels of comfort are with those changes. But see the opportunity and really choose to do that. The second thing is to know yourself and know the environment and be able to either say, this is what you sign up for and what you know you're capable of, but also be able to say, this isn't what I've signed up for. And there are many things that I can do with my talents elsewhere. And then the third thing, if there was any doubt, I just wanted to make it incredibly clear. It is Public Service Recognition Week. I think we should celebrate public servants, not just for 1 week, not just for 1 year, but every single day. There is no doubt that public servants have an impact on every aspect of our lives every single day. That should not be a question whatsoever. Don't let other people write that story. Last thing, who moved my government? Really good question, but who keeps government? It's the public servants.
Really well said, James Christian. Thank you for reminding everyone that it's National Public Servant Appreciation Week. Thanks to you, James Christian, for sponsoring this webinar. We covered a lot of material. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Secretary Slater. 500 people signed up for this. We'll be doing the write-up afterwards to send to everyone, along with the recast of this webinar will be available to audience participants as well. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of the day.